pitcher threw the game, allegedly, and the series. So here are the champions, the 1919 Cincinnati Reds. They did have a good baseball team. And they're the champions. Okay, season is over, we go home, and yeah, there are some rumors here and there, but nobody decides to look into anything. Now, what were the reasons for the fix? Well, Comiskey was known as a skinflint. He didn't pay his players well, except only New York and Boston had bigger payrolls in the American League in 1919. He charged the players for cleaning their uniforms. That is where the Black Sox name comes from. Not the fact that they threw the World Series, but their uniforms were dirty. Cicotte was promised a $5,000 bonus if he won 30 games that year. He won 29. He was benched. Comiskey denied him the bonus. Players had meager salaries, and that left some players open to gamblers who are willing to stuff their pockets with $10,000, $15,000, or $20,000. Big money in 1919. Now, during the trial, or before the trial, Eddie Cicotte in 1920, after he's suspended, in his deposition, says that the 1919 White Sox players had heard of bribe offers of $10,000 to one or more of the Chicago Cubs players in the 1918 World Series between the Red Sox and the Cubs. Now, if you remember the pitcher Babe Ruth was with the Boston Red Sox. Babe Ruth held until Whitey Ford beat the record in 1961, the most consecutive innings thrown without giving up a run in World Series history. Now, it's never been proven in any way, shape, or form whether the Chicago Cubs threw the 1918 World Series. Of course, if they didn't and they won, there'd be no Curse of the Bambino, would there? And we'd lose that in baseball lore. But there were some suspicions about the 1918 World Series. Here's Rothstein. Somehow Rothstein is not involved. Rothstein would go on to other sports betting and other sports scandals, including the 1921 Travers Stakes up at Saratoga, which may or may not have been fixed by Arthur Rothstein. He wasn't ever proven to be involved. He was asked to finance the bribery. He refused, but he knew all about it because he made $350,000 betting on the Cincinnati Reds, which comes out to today's money probably about $5–6 million. So he knew what was going on. He was probably smart enough not to leave any fingerprints anywhere. He would eventually die at the poker game because he didn't pay off the debt. That was about 9 years later. The investigation centered around Abe Attell, the old Chicago fighter. He was a friend and an employee of Rothstein's. I guess, what would be on Attell's business card? Fixer? Anyway, he was involved in making the payments to the players, but Rothstein said, I wouldn't do this. He was never indicted. And so the 1920 season starts. Series had been fixed. Rothstein, Attell, and others never gave anyone a straight story. The fix was uncovered by accident. Despite the fact that there were all kinds of suspicions and rumors that it was fixed, the 1919 World Series, like the 1969 Mets, faded into oblivion. But there was a game between the Chicago Cubs and the Philadelphia Phillies that drew some interest by a grand jury. And they decided to look in whether or not the 1920 one game between the Cubs and Phillies was fixed. But all of a sudden, there was some other evidence that the grand jury got, and they turned their attention. The gambler, Bill Morag, went public with an account of his own involvement in the fix, and all of a sudden the grand jury indicts, and there's a trial. Eddie Cicotte, great pitcher, 29 wins, 1919, testified before the grand jury. I don't know why I did it. I needed the money. I had a wife and kids. Shortly afterwards, Shoeless Joe Jackson, who was functionally illiterate, admitted to accept $5,000 from his teammates, but he had a great World Series in 1919. That doesn't make sense. But anyway, Shoeless Joe Jackson said, I took $5,000. Lefty Williams, Hap Felsch also confessed their involvement. And on October 22nd, 1920, the grand jury handed down the indictment. 8 Chicago players, 5 gamblers, Bill Burns, Sports Sullivan, Abe Attell. No Arnold Rothstein. The indictments included 9 counts of conspiracy to defraud various individuals and institutions. Who were they defrauding? Major League Baseball at that time. Although it wasn't called Major League Baseball, it was the National League and the American League. The judge in the case, Hugo Friend, charged the jury. He told them to return a guilty verdict. They must find the players conspired to defraud the public and others and not merely to throw games. Maybe with that instruction, maybe because of the instruction, the jury came back on August 2nd, 1921. None of them found guilty. Maybe they could go back to Major League Baseball, but there's a new sheriff in town. A guy who had helped baseball in the 19-teens with the Federal League, and eventually baseball would get an antitrust exemption as they went through the courts. And one of the judges that they found going through the Federal League case and the Baltimore Terrapins case, which ended up giving Major League Baseball the antitrust exemption, was a judge named Kennesaw Mountain Landis. He was recently, at 1920, appointed as the commissioner of baseball, and he was there to clean up the game. And his decree was all 8 of those guys were to be permanently banned from baseball. And there's Landis. Landis was a lot of things. He restored some law and order in baseball, but he did a number of other things that didn't exactly help baseball along, including not fighting for Negro players to get into the major leagues. That's Landis. Regardless of the verdict, Landis wrote, no player who throws a game, no player that undertakes or promises to throw a game, no player that sits in conference with a bunch of crooked players and gamblers where the ways and means of throwing a game are discussed and does not promptly tell his club about it will ever play baseball again. It wasn't just the Chicago White Sox 8 players that got tossed out. Maybe 10 men out. 8 men out. There's number 9, Joe Gideon. Joe Gideon was a player with the St. Louis Browns who happened to be friends with Swede Reisberg. And he was present while the players were talking with gamblers, discussing how they were going to fix the 1919 World Series. He was called as a witness in the trial. On November 3rd, 1921, Gideon was banned for life from organized baseball for having guilty knowledge of the Black Sox scandal. So that is the 9th man out. Papers relating to the players' grand jury confessions somehow vanished. Where is Joe Friday when you need him? Well, he would come 30 years later. Did Comiskey and Arnold Rothstein arrange for the papers to be stolen as part of a cover-up? The prosecution's case disappeared. They couldn't find it. It was gone, along with the confessions, never to have been found. In 1956, Gendell gave an interview where he did say, I was the ringleader of it, the 8 men out. 1920, September, here's the chronology. September 28th, 1920, Comiskey suspends the players. Landis becomes the commissioner on November 11th, 1920. Not the last betting scandal by any means. Gendell tells Sports Illustrated, I'm the ringleader. They were all interested and thought we should recontour to see if the dough would really be put on the line. Weaver suggested we get paid in advance. Then if things got too hot, we could double-cross the gambler, keep the cash, and take the big end of the series by beating the Reds. We all agreed this was a brainy plan. They're all gone. So was he after the 1919 season. He had nothing to do with the fixing of the World Series. Hal Chase. Over the years, Hal Chase, great hitter during his 15 years. After the 1919 season, he was playing with the New York Giants. He was banned from the major leagues. Suspicion of gambling. He was also officially banned from the Pacific Coast League, where some players actually made more money than the American and National League, for, among other things, bribing an umpire. So he is 10 man out, and then there's the 11th man out. The Giant teammate, the Triple Crown winner, Heine Zimmerman, was barred from baseball after the 1919 season for fixing games. 10th, 11th man out. So all of a sudden there are 11 guys out, and this guy comes to New York. How he got to New York? Well, he was a bad boy in Boston. You know, Major League Baseball last year actually thought about making a show about Babe Ruth to appeal to young people, because young people don't like baseball anymore, or not in the numbers that they used to. And they were going to do a show called Babe Ruth, Bad Boy. All the bad things about him to make him cool to the generation that they are seeking to watch baseball. But anyway, the Babe all of a sudden is traded to New York. He was a bad boy. Harry Frazee needed some money for No-No in the net, so the Babe ends up with the Yankees and is credited with saving baseball after the scandal. One reporter said about Babe Ruth, this new fan didn't know where first base was, but he heard of Babe Ruth and he wanted to see him hit a home run. When the Babe hit one, the fan went back the next day and knew not only where first base was, but where second base was as well. The Babe became bigger than baseball. The Babe was up there with Al Jolson and Red Grange and Rudolph Valentino in the 1920s. He was bigger than baseball. He was bigger than life. He also made more money than Herbert Hoover in 1932. Had a better year. This is another guy who got suspended as well, Gene Paulette, 12th man out. He was suspended from baseball. He received gifts from St. Louis gamblers in 1919 and offered to throw some games in 1919, the year that the Chicago White Sox players allegedly threw the World Series. Another guy, Jimmy O'Connell. Now, you would think after 1919, 1920, some of these guys would learn that maybe they shouldn't go, even though they're not making much money, maybe they should stay away from gamblers. Final series of the 1924 season, the Giants playing the Philadelphia Phillies at the Polo Grounds. They're battling for the pennant with the Brooklyn Dodgers. O'Connor goes up to the Philadelphia shortstop, Heine Sand. Here's $500 to throw the games. Sam rejected the bribe, reported it to Art Fletcher, the manager of the Phillies. It led to a lifelong suspension of not only O'Connell, but Giants coach Cozy Dolan by Landis. There were others that were thought to maybe be part of this, like Frankie Frisch, George Kelly, and Russ Youngs. Of course, Frankie Frisch, the Fordham Flash, is in the Baseball Hall of Fame. And then there was Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker in 1926. Apparently, they had some action in 1919. Cobb and Speaker were permitted by Ban Johnson, the president of the American League, to resign from baseball. Resign from baseball. They weren't thrown out. They were allowed to resign. Well, Ty Cobb could have made money sitting at home from Coca-Cola. Near the end of the 1926 season, a former pitcher, Dutch Leonard, said that Cobb, Speaker, and Smokey Joe Wood joined him before the 1919 World Series betting on the games because they knew in 1919 that was fixed. Leonard sent letters and other documents to Ban Johnson. Johnson thought they would be so potentially damaging to baseball 7 years after the White Sox that he paid Leonard $20,000 to get rid of the letters. The verdict, Landis exposed the cover-up, and the eventual fallout had Johnson ousted as the American League president. Cobb and Speaker said they didn't do anything wrong. Landis brought them back into baseball because they had not been found guilty of fixing any games, although they bet on it. And Ty Cobb said that he actually won money, the only time he ever bet on baseball, during the 1919 World Series. Now, this guy in the middle is Bill Cox, William Cox, and he is the owner of the Philadelphia Phillies in 1943, and they're at spring training in 1943, and he is the last guy to have been banned in baseball for betting prior to Pete Rose. Cox was the owner of the team. He bet on his team's games. He would eventually come back in the 1960s and try to start a soccer league. He's buried over here in Mount Kisco. So he tried to start a soccer league in the 1960s and failed. But he's the last guy before Pete Rose. Actually, that's not quite true. There's Willie and there's Mickey. You know, they were suspended from baseball, right? They were suspended from baseball. That's 1962, and that is in Candlestick Park during the World Series, the Mick and Willie. 1979, Willie Mays signed as an ambassador of the Steve Wynn's Casino in Atlantic City. Mickey Mantle joined him at Steve Wynn's Casino in Atlantic City in 1983. Each was paid $100,000. You got to remember, Mickey didn't really have a salary in those days, nor did Willie, so they were looking for jobs. Bowie Kuhn, who eventually, Bowie Kuhn would form a law firm with Harvey Meyerson, who is the USFL attorney, in the NFL USFL antitrust suit in 1986. Eventually, the Kuhn-Meyerson law firm would go belly up. Meyerson would go to jail. Bowie Kuhn fled to Florida, trying not to be conspicuous. He was last seen in New York pulling papers out of his office. Anyway, Kuhn said that the appearance of them hanging out with gamblers was not good. And he got rid of Willie and Mickey, which meant Mickey couldn't go to old-timers games and drink with his old Yankee teammates. That's basically what that was about. Now that's Peter Ueberroth. Peter and I didn't get along. We were not the best of friends, although he did buy me and my wife dinner one day at the Scottsdale DoubleTree in 1994 when I told my wife, I said, he owns this DoubleTree. And then Peter said, and she said, you own this DoubleTree? He said, I own all the DoubleTrees. Guy was all the ego. Anyway, so Ueberroth takes over 1984, and he decides one of the first things he needs to look at is whether or not Willie Mays and Mickey Mantle should be banned from baseball. They're banned from baseball, although they were both in the Hall of Fame. There's literally nothing there. They played golf at casino sponsors' outings as celebrities. They were on casino boulevards, but promoting golf events, not gambling. Not even a close call. No umpire needed. And Peter reinstored them to baseball. But Peter had a bigger problem on his hands, a much bigger problem. Charlie Hustle, Pete Rose. Now, when I started covering baseball, it was about 1978, 1979, and Dick Wagner was the general manager of the Cincinnati Reds. And there was a story that floated around baseball in the late 1970s before Pete went to Philadelphia in 1980, that Dick Wagner's biggest nightmare in his life was one day he was going to wake up and find Pete Rose dead because of gambling. Joe Nuxhall once talked about Pete Rose. Nuxhall was the youngest player ever to appear in Major League Baseball at the age of 15 in 1944. He was the Cincinnati Reds announcer. And we were just talking about Pete one day, and he says, you know, it's a good thing Pete never got stuck in the escalator at the Grand Hyatt Hotel in New York. Because if he did, he wouldn't know whether to go